Welcome, Dr. Nathan Richards, Assistant Professor of Black History in the Department of History at the University of Nottingham. I wonder if we might start by you telling us something about your research.
So I not long finished my PhD at the University of Sussex alongside Professor Tim Hitchcock. And so my research is primarily focused on digital Black Atlantic studies. And by that, I'm interested in understanding how the Black past is explored, engaged with through contemporary digital technology. And so it's a huge field really, and I tried to cover a lot in my PhD research, but primarily kind of the archives of enslavement and their relationship to contemporary database technology, the way in which communities use kind of participatory kind of platforms like Wikipedia or other types of platforms to share knowledge and ideas about the past, and the way in which kind of contemporary, more kind of recent technologies like AI and kind of algorithms are shaping kinds of engagements or understandings of the past on platforms like YouTube. So that's primarily what I look at. So it's a broad kind of Black past terrain, and I'm interested in the kind of Atlantic communities and the different ways in which they have culturally and creatively kind of retained their past, but also the kind of professional discipline of history and a kind of academics' engagement with the Black past. That's primarily what I do.
So part of this is reflected in two of the recent pieces of work that you've done. One is locating the Black archives, and the other is a film that you made, Absence from the Academy. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about those and how they have formed your research.
Sure. So Absent from the Academy, it's nearly a decade old now. It was a film I made in 2011 when I was a master's student at Goldsmiths University. And it was really about trying to explore how the absence of Black professors in UK universities kinds of impacts the kind of knowledge productions and the way in which particular types of information is available and accessible in universities. And it was a bit of a red herring to talk about Black professors because it really wasn't about individuals. It was about the absence of particular types of knowledge in universities. And I didn't expect it to become what it did. And so I used a little data to think about the numbers of Black students and then to look at the numbers of Black academics and Black professors specifically. And then it's just started a broader conversation. Okay, so what role do academics play in society, in university? How do they mediate, share particular types of knowledge and information? What happens if there is an absence of particular types of insight and thinkers and people exploring particular types of topics? How does that impact things like medicine, policing, crime, law, all kinds of studies? And I made this short film, I think it's about 40 minutes long, and it just had such a huge kind of impact in the UK. And it created a really big discussion, which led to a second film I did, which was Why Is My Curriculum White? And it was really based off the back of that first film, Absence from the Academy. So the kind of impact was great, and I was glad that it created a conversation in the UK. But I think more so for me, I got to interview some really incredible scholars and academics, and it introduced me to the experiences they were having in UK universities. It gave me a kind of blueprint for how I might exist in a university, some of the things I might face, and whether or not this is a route I should pursue. The more recent chapter that I wrote collaboratively with Hannah Ishmael, Dr. Hannah Ishmael, Etienne Joseph, and Ego Awe and Kelly Foster, it was basically a collection of Black heritage archivists and historians. And we were thinking, well, what does it mean to engage Black heritage in the contemporary, thinking through some of the problems and the politics of archives and historical work. And I wrote specifically on kind of digital, contemporary digital creative practices. And I mentioned a really incredible project called Black in the Day that uses Instagram to share images. And it's very ephemeral, and they don't use metadata, they don't kind of go through the practices that we would consider good historical practice. But there's something that's rich and meaningful and in the moment of the work that they do, and I was really interested in that. It reminds me a lot of kind of carnival practices, which is really for a moment that you live and you experience a kind of memory and you share it with people, and then it kind of fades. And I think if you look back through a lot of kind of Black diaspora and kind of cultural practices, that's the way in which kind of ideas of the past are often engaged, not always, but how they're often engaged. And it was nice to see people using contemporary technology to do that again. And so I wrote about that in the Locating the Black Archive chapter.
I mean, these are central questions with real world applications.
Yeah, I think so. I think these questions are not specific to Black history or the Black past, but I think what Black studies does, and I consider myself primarily a Black studies scholar, I think primarily what it does is because it emerges knowing that it's on the outside of the center of knowledge production, it can see the methodologies and the theories that we use and the practices that are so commonplace for historians. And it kind of highlights, and you can see the problems of those. You can kind of highlight, here's the limitations of these methods and these ideas. Black studies shows us a kind of way.
I'm really, really fascinating stuff, and I think that what you're suggesting here, as you said, is this is like the white heat of historical research, because you can apply a kind of methodology like that about the curation of the past, be it inadequate or not, particularly about those people who, for example, in my period are illiterate, are subnoble, are who are invisible. How do we deal with people like that? And what you're suggesting is that this is a way forward.
Yeah, and it's not so alien, right? Because of course we had whole movements around like history from below, and which are essentially attempting to do the same type of thing. And that, I guess, that's an approach that emerges with a particular type of class analysis, right? And I think what Black Studies does is it continues that kind of class analysis, but it adds ideas around race, nationality, gender, sexuality to all of those types of things, because that's really what, under the banner of Black Studies, kind of contemporary forward-thinking Black Studies, is asking all of those questions around gender, sexuality, and so it's taking that kind of history from below approach, it's adding to that, and it's asking, how can we kind of rethink some of those, the ways in which we engage the past.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So with that in mind, what are you working on at the moment?
At the moment, it seems like what I'm primarily working on, I'm touring a film that I made in 2020 called In the Shadow of Biafra, and it's about the legacy of the Biafran War on Nigeria, but primarily how we engage with the memory of that war through contemporary African literature, Nigerian literature specifically. And so we got to interview some incredible writers and scholars and thinkers for that. And of course, the Biafran War is related to my kind of broader research, because at a national level in Nigeria, the Biafran War isn't really spoken about much. It isn't taught as part of any kind of curricula. And so that memory exists in visual arts, it exists in literature, it exists in some of the music. And so we explored literature in the first film, and we're just beginning a second film alongside the development of a digital archive on visual arts. And we're taking a slightly different approach with this, and we're thinking about, well, what does the Biafran War interrupt? And it interrupts this kind of post-independence hope of Nigeria. And it comes in the middle of it, and it absolutely kind of shatters the vision and aspirations that so many people have for that nation. And so we're exploring how that kind of is represented in the kind of visual arts at that time. Because again, it's just one of the few places in which you can access those types of memories, and there's lots of visual culture that emerge from around that time. So that's primarily what I'm working on.
So moving on from that, I think very interesting, all the research that you've spoken about so far moves on to PhD research in the future. So are there particular areas or particular topics that you would particularly like to see PhD students?
I am really interested in seeing PhD students or supervising projects that have this kind of digital black Atlantic kind of base. I'm interested in students who are interested in digital humanities, in black studies, in black history, in thinking about the problems of the archives, of asking questions primarily at their heart are about knowledge production. How do particular stories emerge, the types of methods that we use, the types of theories that we use, and really asking those complicated critical thinking questions. That's really what I mean. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a period, because I myself don't necessarily specialize in a period. I'm more interested in methods and theories and ways of knowing. And I think if you are a student that's interested in exploring ways of understanding the past, using digital humanities, using black studies, then that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, really interesting, because I think what you're suggesting there is, unlike most PhDs who come in, well, I want to do, 1951 to 1952. This is something different. This is ways of understanding the black past.
Of course, we will narrow your scope of work as you kind of as we get here. But yeah, I'm interested in ways of knowing and understanding the past. So it really is about the problems of archives, the problems of knowledge production in relation to the past. Of course, it's always because I'm in a history department. But in relation to the past, how do we use the archives? How do we use digital humanities? What are the limitations around the archives of enslavement? And, I'm interested in those types of things, about ways of knowing the past in particular. And I think if you're interested in those types of critical discussions, then I would love to supervise those projects.
Right, really, really interesting. So then finally, I think from all the discussions that we've had about your research, the Department of History at Nottingham is well known for its research-led teaching. So in the teaching that you are doing, how does your research weave into that kind of teaching?
Okay, so there's one module I'm currently going to be delivering for the first time this year, which is the Windrush Myth and Memory module. And again, the Windrush element of that is a bit of a red herring. It really is a question. Don't tell the students that just yet. It really is about, well, how did this story of the Windrush kind of come to be? What does it obscure? And from the research and the work that I've done on this topic, the Windrush is an invention. It's invented in two specific moments, in 48 and in 98, really two kind of key moments. And I'm interested in, how did that kind of come to be? What were the ways in which this idea of the Windrush ascended to a kind of national consciousness? But more importantly, what does it obscure? What doesn't it tell us? And really the story of the Windrush, once we kind of unpack it, is really about the story of empire, the comings of goings of people in Britain over the last 500 years, right? And we would rather a very safe and quaint story of, we welcome these people here, as opposed to a more complicated story, which is that we were all over the world and people were coming and going from the motherland to these colonies just for hundreds of years. And it's a more complicated, combative history, and it's the more imperial history that we would rather not discuss. And so I'm teaching a module on this, and really what I'm trying to do is to get students to think more critically about national histories, about the nature of archives, and how particular stories come to be. And my hope is also to develop in November an option, I think it's for the second year, and this is really about using literature and the way in which we have used things like Afro sci-fi, science fiction, to represent and explore aspects of the Black past. And so both of those are about the ways of knowing.
That's really fascinating. I mean, one of the things about the Windrush example is that something that we can take from history, particularly at degree level and later, is that the world is much more complicated than it seems. And this is an excellent example of that. Well, that's really interesting. Dr. Nathan Richards, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.